I had one conversation with Marvel about making a fighting game.
Yes.
What? When?
I did, but I probably shouldn't talk about it.
Are you excited about that idea?
Oh God, yes. We would love to make like a Marvel fighting game or Marvel versus DC. I think would be the coolest.
I feel like it's a race between you and TT Games for getting that Marvel versus DC. I'm rooting for you guys.
Yeah.
Hey, what is up, guys? It is Slick or Slickmoff here, back again with another video, and I'm joined by a very special guest, one of the largest YouTubers in the comic book superhero video game space, and that is Evan Falarka. Evan, how are you doing today, sir?
Man, I am down to clown. I'm ready to go, and dude, I'm very honored to be here once again on your fantastic channel. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. We literally just filmed a collab where I'm going to be on his channel. So if you want to see me on his channel talking about the Guardians of the Galaxy video game, go check that out for sure. I'll leave a link in the description below as well to Evan's channel and that video. In this video, we're going to be talking about a very special and exciting potential video game that has been heavily teased by Ed Boone over at NetherRealm, and that is Marvel versus DC. So obviously, NetherRealm, who creates the Injustice series and Mortal Kombat series, they have just announced that they are done with Mortal Kombat 11. They are not doing any more installments on the DLC side, and that set the internet ablaze. People were pissed and were very upset that there was allegedly a lack of transparency between the fans and the and NetherRealm, and that they ended the post sort of DLC content too early. We're not here to really talk about that. It's just important news to note that NetherRealm is no longer working on Mortal Kombat 11 in any way whatsoever as it pertains to DLC or expanding content for that game. So that creates the very important dilemma here that they are now working fully on their next project. And that next project has been heavily teased by Ed Boone to be a Marvel vs. DC game. We have this tweet here where he tweeted James Gunn, who has directed Guardians of the Galaxy and Suicide Squad. And Ed Boone says, wow, James Gunn has managed to work on DC and Marvel movies. That's impressive, thinking face. So obviously Ed Boone is known to be quite the troll. And we have this article here from CBR that says, it seems likely that NetherRealm is working on some kind of Marvel project, though that's not where the speculation ends. Plenty of fighting game fans have noticed hints towards an even more ambitious project than a Marvel fighting game. Everything from the timing to the reception towards previous Marvel fighting games seems to line up with the theory that a Marvel vs. DC crossover fighting game could actually happen. And that obviously is just one tweet that he has made teasing Marvel vs. DC. There are many other things here. It also just makes sense given that Injustice 2 doesn't really lead into a natural end to that trilogy. We can talk about that a little bit more here, but I wanted to get your thoughts on the potential of this game more broadly. Would you be more excited to see a Marvel vs. DC fighting game from NetherRealm than, say, Injustice 2? I certainly can safely say it would sell way more copies for obvious reasons, which we can delve into further. But yeah, I'm just curious to know, which would you be more excited to see, Injustice 3 or Marvel vs. DC?
So I have a confession to make, okay? This is an exclusive on Slickmoff channel. This is a full-on, flat-out, direct confession of how ass I am at every single NetherRealm game that ever existed. I cannot play at all Mortal Kombat. I'm sure I would lose every single match if I were to fight Slickmoff for Salvage or Iron Gen on Injustice 2. That is a direct fact. That being said, I thoroughly enjoy each of those games for what they are. I have played Injustice 1 and 2. I am a fan of sorts of that series and the narrative that they have gone and done with Superman-ish being evil and a tyrant and pretty much a dictator in the superhero realm in that whole universe, which is an interesting take, I suppose. Not a fan of evil Superman too much, but Justice 3 would surely get people interested in that series. But Marvel versus DC, I think, needs to happen. At this point, we're kind of starved in terms of just superhero gaming content as it is, but mainly for good superhero fighting games. I mean, the last one that we got from Marvel, infamously, was Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, which was a huge flop. Absolutely terrible, god-awful garbage. Do not play it. Everyone, if you want to play a Marvel fighting game, either A, play Marvel Nemesis, Rise of the Imperfects, great game, or B, if you have to play one of the Capcom installments, play Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. That's the better one. Infinite was a terrible, terrible game. Do not play it. And DC, Injustice 2 did okay from what I understand in terms of sales and reviews, but it wasn't anything too huge of a spectacle. So Marvel vs. DC would, like Slickmoff said, not only combine two of these amazing franchises together that we all know and love, but also bring in so many new players and fans alike to, if that is their first ever NetherRealm fighting game, if they've never played a Mortal Kombat game before, or even played any of the previous Injustice games, having these two mega franchises, these two incredible universes pit off against one another would be probably one of the biggest things to happen in gaming. I know that's a bit of an over-exaggeration, a slight over-exaggeration, but in all honesty, who wouldn't want to play as Superman fighting Spider-Man? Who wouldn't want to play as Batman fighting Daredevil? Who wouldn't want to play as Wonder Woman fighting Captain Marvel? Any of these cool matchups that you always had as a kid, you could do in this game. And it would really be a really cool, unique way to combine what NetherRealm has done in the past with the Injustice series, and also bring new life from Marvel into the fighting game spectrum. We haven't really had a whole lot of iconic Marvel fighting games, some really good ones with the Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and Marvel vs. Capcom 3 installments, and I personally really love Marvel Nemesis, but nothing to, write home about. Would totally flip the tables, and I would totally be down for any type versus DC fighting game.
Well, here's the thing, too. Injustice 2 sold 1.5 million copies. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite sold around the same at 1.5 million. Spider-Man PS4 now has sold over 20 million copies. So I say that to say not that Injustice 2 is not successful or anything, but in the grand scheme of things, compared to Batman Arkham or Spider-Man PS4, it doesn't really compare. And the way that they would boost those sales from 1.5 million copies to 10 million, I think, would be Marvel vs. DC. Like, let's just be honest. Everybody would be more excited for that game. One, you're bringing in Marvel fans. You're doubling your fan base instantly. There are Marvel fans who are just not going to play Injustice. They're like, well, not only is it DC, which they might not be a fan of, but it also is like a subsect of DC. It's like the dystopian sort of like Earth 2, Earth 3 take on DC, where it's like you said, Superman is like this like fascist dictator, and he's just like laser beaming everybody for no reason. I mean, not for no reason, but you know what I'm saying. Basically, it's not only that it is DC, but it's also like this more niche angle of DC Comics more broadly. It is not like Justice League, or if you're a fan of the animated series or something, you can just hop right in. It is a totally different world and universe. More broadly, though, you're bringing in all of the Marvel fans, and you have those brand notoriety, on the line, where obviously the age-old debate is which is better, Marvel versus DC? And I can just imagine how fun it would be. Playing Injustice 2 versus you would be a lot of fun, and we've done that in the past. But what would be more fun is if I'm playing as Batman and you're playing as Spider-Man, right? Just because of, those are our favorite characters respectively. And you get that pride in the line of who would win in a fight, Spider-Man or Batman, and then you're like battling it out, and there's just more on the line there in those fights. So I think that it would just be such a fun experience to get this game. Quite frankly, it would be a totally different and unique experience. And like I said, I'd get on all my friends who are huge Marvel guys or gals, and then I would just play as Batman and try to win every game and try to prove that DC is superior, or Batman is superior, or whatever. And it's all in good fun. I'm being facetious, broadly speaking, but it would be a really fun experience, I think. And again, going back to Injustice 2, it is sold well, don't get me wrong, but it is not like 10 million copies or anything like that. And I think in order to get there, DC is looking at, okay, Injustice is cool, it's been doing well for us, but how do we really take this next step and really create one of the most successful games of this generation? And the way to do that would be Marvel versus DC. And they've done, obviously, DC versus Mortal Kombat in the past. So they're acclimated to doing these crossover video games. And this just makes sense. I think that Marvel would agree to it. So I think it's already in the works, frankly. And I'm going to be honest. If this is real and it is Marvel versus DC, it will be one of my most anticipated games of this generation, perhaps behind Gotham Knights. This would be number 2. Versus if it's Injustice 3, I will be excited. Don't get me wrong. Don't freak out and unsubscribe. I'm not saying I wouldn't be excited, but I am saying that I would be a fair bit less excited than Marvel versus DC, honestly, because again, going back to the plot, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, Evan. I don't think there's really anywhere to go after Injustice 2. I think that the Injustice storyline has served its purpose and is really interesting, but I don't really know that I want to see the sequel to Injustice 2 or play like another 8-hour story campaign in that universe. I think that Injustice 2 put a fine bookmark end to this franchise, and not that there should never be an Injustice 3 down the line, but I honestly, I hope that their next game is Marvel vs. DC.
Yeah, because it's really interesting where they went. Obviously, you can play as each individual character, and they have their own unique kind of side stories with the arcade mode when you fight Brainiac, and then they kind of do things their own way. But for the main campaign, you're right. Yeah, kind of put like a little nice bow on the present, where, of course, there's the, in my opinion, god-awful evil Superman ending where he basically becomes Brainiac and he controls the ship and all the other heroes and Batman specifically. That's like the evil ending. In my opinion, I see the Batman ending as the canon ending where he sends Superman back to the Phantom Zone, kind of stops the Brainiac threat. He tries to save everyone he could on the ship, and then he recruits Supergirl to be part of like the new Justice League, which is cool. But then, yeah, if you were to do Injustice 3, would you fight Superman again? Go through that same story again? Like, that seems kind of repetitive, and it's more the same. Whereas if you were to do, again, another Mortal Kombat, like, well, we just came off of MK11. We already saw a huge story with that, and a lot of people were kind of, in my eyes, what I've seen from online reviews and stuff, they were kind of divided from MK11. They liked parts of it, but it felt like it kind of backtracked from the previous installments of those games in that series. Whereas if you did DC and Marvel in one cohesive game, you're absolutely right. That would bring in so many new fans, a huge audience, already doubling your fan base, which is probably going to double in sales. Even someone like me who can't play a fighting game for his life would instantly buy that, because not only would I want to support the game and Marvel and DC as companies and as game developers, but also because it's something completely new and different that has never been seen before in that big of a scale for a fighting game genre. Of course, there are the crossovers, like Slickmoff said, with Mortal Kombat versus DC, which in my opinion was a fun enough game, and then Marvel versus Capcom. We have seen these fighting game crossovers before, but those two iconic franchises in particular, Marvel and DC Comics, together in one game, and add on a very interesting narrative on top of that, where you could have, I don't know, Thanos come in and Darkseid, and they could go and fight off against each other in a really cool boss fight, and you can play as one or the other, and then they cause this multiverse rift where they bring in all these other characters from both universes and maybe some multiverse counterparts at the same time too. There's so many infinite possibilities that you could do for a narrative structured fighting game for both of these iconic companies with all these incredibly well developed characters in these universes that we all love as fans. And pitting them against each other would be the ideal scenario for a fighting game of this magnitude. And seeing how, of course, Ed Boone himself loves Injustice as a series, and he's also said he loves Marvel as a brand as well, and how he would obviously want to do something like that and actually create something of that big of a scale for a fighting game, not just as like a superhero action adventure game like the Arkham series or Insomniac Spider-Man games, but a fighting game specifically in that realm of utilizing these two would be incredible to see. And I would definitely try and train my hardest to get better at these types of 2D fighting games, just so I could be good enough to hopefully stand against Slickmoff and Salvage and Iron Gin during inevitable matches, because that would be incredible.
Well, dude, think about it like this too. Like we said, Injustice 2 didn't sell great. Mortal Kombat actually sold better. And Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite also didn't sell well. So I think Marvel and DC are both in this place where on the fighting game side of their game catalog, right, you have like the single player RPG games, you have like the more multiplayer online open world games, and you have fighting games. And I think on the fighting game side, both Marvel and DC are kind of at an impasse where they don't really know where to go next. And thus, this is the perfect opportunity. This all makes a lot of sense. Like when I first was reading about some of these leaks and rumors, and then also seeing Ed Boone's teases, I had kind of thought, well, this is a bit unlikely. Honestly, there's so many brand implications here. But then you think about it more and more, and it makes so much sense. You think about the lift that would be there as it pertains to sales, right? Like we said. This game would blow any Injustice 1 or Injustice 2 sales out of the water. It would blow Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite sales out of the water. It just makes a lot of sense from the business side. And of course, we're talking about profit-seeking corporations here. They're very cognizant of how much money these games are going to make in. And let's be honest, too, making Marvel vs. DC is going to be just as difficult as making Injustice 3, which is going to sell better, which is going to make more money. Marvel vs. DC would make infinitely more money for Warner Brothers and for Capcom and for NetherRealm, frankly, even if they have to pay Marvel a huge chunk of the revenue, which of course they would. They're using their IP and properties. Secondly, let's talk about the story. Is there more potential in making an Injustice 3 and making an engaging and fun story, or Marvel vs. DC and starting from the ground up, right? To me, it's evident that that's the case. And here's the other thing. In the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen this huge expansion as it pertains to superhero films, right, on the MCU side, and then also with DC, with the DCEU and Man of Steel and even Green Lantern to some extent. You know, we've really seen a huge expansion in these brands in terms of the pop culture. This is the perfect time to do this. Obviously, in the 90s, they had the Marvel vs. DC comics, which were successful, even though they weren't executed great. Obviously, there was a lot of criticism from fans back in the time. But I think that the concept had a lot of hype around it, and it still does. It still is the sort of thing that you can drop this at any point, and people are going to be excited. And like I said, people's favorite brand is on the line. I think that it would just add so much fun and excitement to having Batman versus Spider-Man or having Superman versus Thor, and being able to do that. People would be so invested. People would have entire tournaments where they play as one side and pick their favorite brand, whether that be DC or Marvel. From the multiplayer side, it would be extremely fun. There would be so much hype around the brand marketing. If I were them, they'd just lean into which is better, Marvel or DC? And people would just be throwing their comments and opinions in there. Who would win in a fight, Batman versus Spider-Man? You just set the internet ablaze. It would be #1 trend on Twitter, probably, of that fight and debate happening, because it's just an age-old debate that people have been having for decades and decades and will never, ever be settled, because it just depends on who's writing, on who's going to win. I've always thought those debates are kind of amusing and in a sense kind of pointless, because it's you can write it either way. It's kind of difficult to determine objectively who would win. But anyway, that's an aside. Broadly speaking, I think that there is so much potential in doing this. It just makes sense on every angle. It makes sense from the marketing perspective. It makes sense from the game perspective of where do you go after Injustice 3? Is anybody really amped to see a trilogy with that? Of course people are. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But would that same person rather see Marvel vs. DC and taking the Injustice universe and continuing it? Basically, it can be an Injustice 3 of sorts. You could even parlay this very easily. Let's say that you do have the bad ending of Injustice 2, where Superman is sort of this tyrannical dictator of sorts. And then the Marvel universe uses the boom tube or something somehow and merges into this Injustice universe, and then they are trying to stop the Superman, and maybe it's even Batman and Spider-Man and Thor and Captain America all team up to fight against Superman. And it's the DC universe alone isn't strong enough to stop Superman, but they need the power of the Marvel universe as well, or something. Who knows? I'm just throwing ideas out there. I'm sure they'll craft something much better than that. But I think there's a lot of really interesting directions to take. I do think that they can still continue the Injustice universe in it, so it can be an Injustice 3 of sorts, but just feature the Marvel universe as well. And I think that it would be a huge viral hit on all fronts. So putting everything together here from the teases and the gameplay potential, I think it just makes a lot of sense. And I really do think this is the direction that they're going to move in.
Just to bounce off what you said, I totally agree. And the best part about it is that it's safe. What we were talking about in a previous video that we did on my channel about the Guardians of the Galaxy game is that in comparison to Marvel's Avengers, is that where it was a live service, multiplayer-centric game, and that really didn't do too well amongst the general community because that's not what they're used to. And it was a big risk, and it did not pay off. Guardians is going the more single-player, story-driven route, and that is a safer route because that's what people know from the Spider-Man games and from the Batman games. A DC Marvel fighting game is an easy win. Hands down. Everyone loves DC, everyone loves Marvel, everyone loves all these characters. putting them both into one game together would be a total win for both companies together. And it would totally just get a lot of people invested even more in both franchises. Like, oh man, I've been waiting for another Injustice type game with the DC characters. Or man, there's no good Marvel fighting games out there. Well, here you go. Marvel and DC, boom, together, fighting each other. Easy win for everyone involved. And I think it would totally do well in terms of sales. NetherRealm has already proven themselves to make great fighting games in general for Mortal Kombat and Injustice, so the gameplay would obviously be rock solid. I'm not worried about that. Stories are a bit hit or miss for some of their games, so that's the one area I would be concerned about. But for the most part, I feel confident in saying it would be a well-made game that would get the job done for being what it is, which is just a nice, cool, brawling fighting game with both Marvel and DC unified together. And then adding a cool story on top of that would just be the cherry on top of this amazing package if they were to do so. So I cannot wait. I totally have full faith in NetherRealm if they go that route, which I really hope that they do. And I definitely think it would also be a good step in the right direction for Marvel Games, considering that you don't want to just associate them fully with the Insomniac Spider-Man games. Those are fantastic games. They should also expand their portfolio and broaden their horizons for other genres besides these single-player action-adventure games. Doing a fighting game of that magnitude with NetherRealm would be a huge win for them, and obviously also would further expand the fan bases for both DC and Marvel consecutively. So I, for one, am totally down and can't wait to see how this exactly will play out.
Well, the other thing that's crazy is that as the CBR article reports, Warner Brothers Interactive, the publisher that handles DC games, has also published Marvel games in the past. Lego Marvel's Avengers and Lego Marvel Superheroes were both published by Warner Brothers Interactive and Marvel Games, showing that relationships may exist for Marvel and DC to cross over in a fighting game. So that's obviously a really interesting component as well, sort of going off of what you said of that it would be a win-win and it would sell well. There also is a precedent here that this definitely could happen. Now, the other alternative is that it is a standalone Marvel game. That to me seems less likely. Maybe it's just because I hope that it's not the case. I'm really sold on this DC versus Marvel idea. I would obviously love a standalone Marvel fighting game done by Mortal Kombat, but done by NetherRealm. So don't get me wrong there. But to me, there's just a lot more potential at a DC versus Marvel game. It's been like decades now since they've done that crossover in the comics. It's something that really is actually underexplored, frankly. And I would absolutely love to see this game. So. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible that this is a standalone Marvel game, as we saw with Warner Brothers and Marvel publishing those Lego Marvel games that didn't have anything to do with DC. WB did publish that. Again, seems less likely. It seems like this is an opportunity to mix the Injustice universe and merge that with Marvel and do a crossover style like DC versus Mortal Kombat was. But hey, you never know. You never know what they're going to do. This could be a standalone Marvel game. Again, I think that would be weird. Like, do you see that happening at all, Evan?
Maybe. I mean, it'd be cool for sure. Just get Marvel's Injustice pretty much, just with only Marvel, only characters for only Marvel-centric story. I'd be interested in that, but I definitely think that a Marvel and DC game cohesively would get more appeal from the general public. I mean, a Marvel version of Injustice would just be that. Like, I don't see it being anything too different. Just an Injustice with a Marvel skin. Whereas a Marvel versus DC would be something fully different and would present some rather interesting challenges that they could hopefully overcome in development. Like, how do you make the DC characters rival that of the Marvel characters? Because for the most part, a lot of the DC characters are rather seen as like gods, or at least seen as really highly powered individuals like Superman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Aquaman. And then you got Marvel with the more kind of grounded level heroes like Iron Man. He has no powers. Captain America, he's a super soldier, but he's still just kind of a regular guy. Spider-Man, Thor, he is a god from Asgard. But, all that, like, how do you pit them against each other in a way that makes sense narratively and just structurally for balancing all their powers together in a way that would feel fresh and natural for the characters and who they are? That is what I think is more interesting compared to just, it's Marvel versus Marvel game. or Avengers versus X-Men, for example, or Guardians versus Fantastic Four. Like, I don't know if I'd be too interested in that because, again, I would just see it as like a Marvel-branded injustice. Whereas if you have Marvel versus DC, there's a lot more opportunity there.
Yeah, and you already know what it would look like. It'd be like Captain America is with Hydra, and then Iron Man has to stop him. It's like you already know what they would do. They'd basically just replace Superman with Captain America as the evil one, probably.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. It's like, do I really want to see basically Injustice with a Marvel skin on it? Not really, because I feel like I already know what it's going to be. I would much rather, as you pointed out, I would much rather see this Marvel versus DC game. So, hey, fingers crossed, we will talk about this more in the months to come as we get more information. Obviously, it's been now several years since Mortal Kombat 11 came out, so I think we're actually getting pretty close here. And just for the record as well, they said that they're no longer doing Mortal Kombat DLC. They've already been working on their next game. It was just like a split endeavor where some people were working on Mortal Kombat support, some were working on the next game. Now they are 100% grinding out on their next title. So I think probably next year we can expect to see this game, and hopefully we can learn more at DC Fandom in October on this game, and hopefully we will get an announcement of Marvel versus DC. I think we're in alignment that would be a really, really fun title and direction to go with. So Evan, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. Like I said, guys, check out his link in the description below for his channel and our collab together. So we're sort of cross-collaborating here. Evan, thank you so much for coming on, man. Anything you want to plug? Shout out.
I'm just very thankful and just so lucky to be here again on your channel, Slickmoff. I truly always love our discussions that we have about these superhero games. I'm a massive superhero gamer at heart, so these are the types of experiences I love to see in mainstream media. And if something like this were to happen, I would be totally in love for a Marvel vs. DC game. That would be a dream come true for a lot of fans, including ourselves. Plugging, no, just follow me on YouTube and Twitter. I'm always talking about superhero games, mainly Marvel. Spider-Man, of course, whenever the mood strikes and whenever there's actual news to talk about. I'm your guy, and so is Slickmoff, of course. But until then, I'll just be on the sidelines getting hyped like all of you guys out there as well.
Absolutely, guys. Go subscribe to Evan Falarka. I will link his channel in the description below. Evan, thank you so much for coming on. My name is Slickmoff. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and comment your thoughts on Marvel vs. DC in the comment section below. My name is Slickmoff. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.